Presuming you've had veggie patches or you're getting one started, you might have heard about this topic called crop rotation. What is it? Why do we crop rotate? Well, the reason for it to happen, it has been happening for centuries, millennia, I suppose. Farmers or gardeners understood the need to move crops, not to grow them in the same spot year after year because of disease build-up in the soil. And here's a classic one with a family of plants called from the tomato plants. These are both tomatoes that you're seeing on the screen, where they're growing nicely and then suddenly the one on the left-hand side just sort of died and the one on the right-hand side starts to, all its leaves start to curl over. And without even understanding why it's happening, it's a message to the grower, in this case it was me, to make sure that I don't grow my tomatoes in the same spot year after year, because there are diseases that will lurk in the soil and may attack future crops of, say, the tomato plants. Now, there are two plant families that are really susceptible to soil-borne diseases. And one is called the Solanaceae family, which is the tomato family. So that includes tomatoes, eggplants, potatoes, capsicum, chili, and so on. So if you're finding that you're growing them year after year and you're just not getting good results or the plants are dying, have a look at the fact that you might be growing them in the same spot year after year. That could be one reason. So that's the main reason people used to crop rotate, but there is another one as well. And I call it nutrient cycling in your veggie patch. So we've got to understand that not all plants use the same nutrients in the soil. Some will use a lot more, others will use less. So the ones that use more might be called, I class them as what they're called heavy feeders. They love a lovely, rich, nutritious soil. And then there are others that don't need as much. And then there's some that actually put nutrition back into your soil. So if you can understand these different plant families, and we're going to go through them now, that gives you an idea of, well, if I planted something that has used up a lot of nutrients in the soil, maybe I should follow it with something that doesn't need as much. And that sort of helps you do less work in your garden, but also just understands the cycling. So let's have a look at it. The plant groups for nutrient cycling, the heavy feeders, and I'm classing them as in either they grow in the warm season, which is between October and March, or the cool season between April and September. And these plants might be the heavy feeders that you may have, well, have finished now, would be, again, that Solanaceae family, tomatoes, eggplant, capsicum, potatoes. Now, also they're cucurbits. So pumpkins, cucumbers, squash, zucchini, anything in that family. And then others that are classed loosely as other, such things like sweet corn, lettuces, basil. They love a great rich soil. Growing at the moment, that will be using up lots of nutrients. Things from the brassica family. So you may have broccoli growing, or cabbages, cauliflower, any of the Asian veggies. There's heaps of them. Lots of leafy greens love a lovely, rich, nutritious soil. Silver beet, spinach, rocket, coriander. And alliums, or in particular, the garlic. Most alliums, which is the onion family, aren't heavy feeders, but garlic is a heavy feeder. So let's keep that in mind. So what doesn't use much nutrient from the soil are the light feeders. So over the warm season, you might be growing some root vegetables such as carrots, beetroot, radishes, parsnips. Root vegetables typically are light feeders. Put them into a heavily enriched soil, and what happens is that you'll get lots of top growth or lots of leafy growth, and the roots themselves, the part that you want to eat, aren't, there's not much to them at all, which is very, very disappointing. Now, here's the allium family. So spring onions are light feeders, and there's others. I've just picked these this morning. Jerusalem artichokes, they grow on their own. You don't need to do anything to the soil. They keep growing. So I don't know if people are familiar with Jerusalem artichokes. They look a little bit like ginger, but you'd use them as you'd use a potato. And they grow over summer. The cool season, light feeders, the root vegetables, so you can still be growing carrots, beetroot, radishes, parsnips at the moment. And again, the alliums can be growing over winter as well. So some of those salad onions, as in that picture, shallots, which by shallots I mean something that resembles a long thin onion, I suppose, with the brown or the pink skin to it, and leeks as well. They're all light feeding vegetables. They don't need a heavily enriched soil. The other plant groups are legumes. Now, if you know anything about these at all, not only do they feed us and they're high in protein, they also feed the soil by virtue of the nodules that are attached to their plant roots. Grown over summer would be beans, but grown over winter, things like peas, sugar snap peas, where you eat the pod and the pea itself, broad beans, snow peas, they all are a class of their own and they're called legumes. So by putting them in your soil, you'll get a feed as well, but they feed the soil just by virtue of these nodules on their roots. So let's have a look at crop rotation, understanding what are heavy feeders, light feeders, and so on. So this is letting the soil work for you. So we go it by season. I don't mean spring, summer, autumn, winter. I'm meaning warm season, cool season. So if you planted a heavy feeder, it may be followed by a light feeder. A legume might be planted before a heavy feeding crop. Now notice I've got a square there or a rectangle. There's a fourth corner. You might be wondering, well, what's going to go there? It's this stuff called green manure. Hopefully you're familiar with what a green manure is, but it is something that we plant and we put in the soil just to feed the soil itself. It's not going to feed us, and I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail in a sec. So in terms of crop rotation, a heavy feeder would be followed by a light feeder. A light feeder, now everything has been depleted from the soil. Let's just put something in just to feed the soil itself, this green manure. Once the green manure has broken down, let's put in some legumes, and legumes will then continue to feed the soil so the heavy feeders can go in. So what does this mean though in terms of, in practical terms? Well, let's just first look at the green manure just to make you a bit more familiar with it. So green manure are seeds that you buy them in bulk, and they will have legume seeds in them. Now remember I said legumes will feed the soil, and they put particular nitrogen into the soil. And then there'll be some sort of grass type seeds or cereal grain seeds that once they're chopped back into the soil, they provide that bulky organic matter. It's like putting compost into your soil, but it's like a living compost. And you might buy it in a bag like that. It gets sold as a green manure mix. And the description there, revitalises garden and vegetable beds over winter. I tend to only grow green manure crops over winter, simply because over summer I want my vegetable beds to be feeding me. So sometimes I skip that green manure step. But once the way we plant it, you don't go and sort of plant each seed at a time. You scatter the seed over your soil. Cover it up a little bit, and by covering it just means get a rake and just roughly raking it over. If the soil's not wet already, you might need to water it, but haven't we had a lovely start to winter with all this beautiful rain? And just if we do end up having a very dry winter, you might need to water it, but otherwise it'll just live on rainfall alone. And that's what it might look like. So a thick, dense mass of, and I can see, if we look at these, so I can see grassy stuff. Let me just get my pointer here. So that's my pointer. So that's the grassy stuff there. These things here and these here would be legume based. So once you've got that there, it gets to about knee high or just before it flowers, you go in there with a sharp spade and you start to just chop it down and lightly cover it again. And gradually it will decompose and feeds your soil all over again, so that when you go to plant again, you certainly don't need to add compost. It's happened for you. So green manure, like I said before, I tend to grow them over winter time in garden beds that at my place don't get any sunshine. It's very difficult to grow things that when you don't have direct sunlight, and I do have that case in wintertime. So I put a green manure crop instead. And then I chop it all down, and then it's ready to start planting again as soon as I'm ready to plant, or as soon as the sun gets a little bit higher and those gardens get a bit of sunshine. So in practical sense, for example, if you grew beans over summer, legumes are followed by heavy feeders. In winter time, you might be growing broccoli. Broccoli is a brassica, which is a heavy feeder. Or if you grew tomatoes over summer, heavy feeders are followed by light feeders. You might put in some carrots instead after your tomatoes. Or if you grew pumpkins, cucurbit family are heavy feeders. You're going to follow it by something that doesn't need much. It could be carrots, for example, but here I've got spring onions instead because they're part of the allium family and they are light feeders. Or if you had onions growing over summer, by the time you've pulled them all out, the soil is well and truly depleted, and over winter you might be growing a green manure crop. So see the delineations between our vegetable patches there, and there's one that's just dedicated to that green manure crop. The rest aren't. So I sort of am quite particular about what I grow where. But how am I going to remember what I grow where? I've got quite extensive vegetable patches. And honestly, I'm not going to remember from one year to the next what went in beforehand. So this is where I keep, and well, you know, when the kids did art at school, they always came back with these, you know, art folder type things. And I sketch out just very roughly my vegetable patches, and I will put in there at the start of the season, I'll write down what I'm planning to plant there after I refer to what I've planted in previous seasons. So here I'm keeping in mind, first of all, not to put those plants that are problematic with their soil diseases, such as broccoli and cabbages and so on, but also for tomatoes and potatoes. I make sure that I don't put those in the same bed year after year. Ideally, your crop rotation for those things is to try and avoid planting them in the same spot for at least 3 to 4 years. Now, I can see you sort of throwing your hands up in horror. So, you know, you might not have such extensive garden beds that you can crop rotate to that extent. And to break the cycle, sometimes you may need to grow your broccoli, say, in large pots one winter time, or likewise your tomatoes in large pots over summertime, just so as you don't put them back into those beds. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. I'm not saying you can't do it, but just watch out because there may be problems. And a classic example that I'll always cite is my father-in-law. Great gardener, loved his garden, but there wasn't much to it. But over summer, it'd be all tomatoes, and over winter, it'd be all broccoli. Now, year after year, those tomatoes would get to a certain height, and then they would just keel over and die. Basically, he did have that build-up of soil diseases, and he kept blaming birds and everything else. And, you know, it was hard to tell him because he was just an old gardener set in his ways. You know, you can't keep planting the things year after year in the same spot. He said, yeah, but I bring in chicken manure and everything else. Regardless, you've still got those soil diseases lurking, waiting to latch onto the roots of the plants that they love to feed off or to attack. So this is where my garden diary comes in. I have a look at what I've planted previous years. So up here, I'll write down cool season 2020, and that's what I'm planting. Now, at the end of the year, at the end of the season, I'll go back and make amendments to this. Say, for example, I'm growing perpetual spinach in this bed here, but really for me, it's wishful thinking because that's in perpetual shade at the moment, and so they're just not growing very well. And I just have to remind myself next year, don't try and grow in this bed. Do something else there, put in a green manure crop instead, because it's just not going to work. here is one note, for example, that I made for myself. Don't plant peas amongst pea straw. So I put in peas this year, and then I put pea straw down as well, just to cover the soil a little bit, just to stop weeds coming up all the time. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. This year I decided to, but I put in pea straw. Now, if anyone's ever used pea straw before, you know that there's peas lurking in that pea straw, and they will pop up quite quickly. And so I can't distinguish at the moment which are the peas that I planted and which are the peas that have come up because of the pea straw. Hopefully, eventually, once they start to flower, I will be able to tell, because the ones that come up along through pea straw are pink flowers, and they're not edible. They're grown as fodder and everything else. They're not really edible for us. So hopefully I'll be able to distinguish the white flowers, which are the ones I planted, compared to the pink flowers of the pea straw. But this is just a note to myself, in case I make that same mistake again next year. Don't do that, Maria. So I keep the visual diary, but I also keep a written diary. And this is where I might put a date, and this is just an old exercise book again, of what I did when. So for example, the 7th of April this year, I planted out some sprouted telephone peas, green feast peas, and I sowed some more. Now, sowing some more, for example, here, I should expect that within a fortnight, I should see them coming up. And so I will go and check, because I've got a date here. I don't remember. I always think, yeah, I'll remember. I did it that Monday, you know, that we did such and such, but it doesn't work that way. And so this is why I keep a written diary as well, just to remind myself of what I've done in the garden. Now, I don't do this religiously. Trust me, I'm out there, I'm thinking, oh, I should write this down. And then I come inside and I forget. But if I do remember, I do write things down. And that just gives you an idea too, from season to season, how things change, so that you can adapt what you're doing accordingly. So that's why I keep both a visual and a written diary as well.